in Christ, growing in the faith, and serving the world.
So Pastor Carl came to me a few months ago and asked me if I'd be interested in doing the Mother's Day service, and I was like, sure, that sounds awesome. And then I started thinking about it. I'm like, wow, that's a lot of responsibility. Mother's Day, you don't want to fail there. And so I started thinking about, like, okay, what would be a good way to encourage the mothers here at First Baptist, and just in what they do, and just the blessing that they are each day to us. And as I was thinking about that and praying about it, God kind of brought the topic of, well, why don't you speak to the husbands? And I was like, because it's Mother's Day, duh. And then I started thinking about more, and I was like, all right, God, if that's what you want me to speak on, then that's what I'll speak on. And over the last few weeks, as I've been kind of preparing things and putting illustrations together and researching passages, God has really opened my eyes to just what kind of a blessing as husbands we can be to our wives, and hopefully, if not already, the mother of our children. And just want to, mothers of our, hopefully I said that right, but you know what I mean. But husbands can be an encouragement, they can be a foundation, they can be a strength to their wives, or they can be someone that kind of knocks them down, that discourages them. And this morning, there's a passage I want to look at in Ephesians chapter 5, and it's going to just give us an idea of how, as husbands, we're to love our wives, what that looks like. And Paul, in this book, in this chapter, gives us a really good illustration of what loving our wives looks like. A challenging illustration as well. In chapter 5, Paul lists some responsibilities of Christians in our relationship to a couple of different topics. He refers to our responsibility as believers in relation to other believers, in relation to spiritual gifts, in relation to the former life, which is before we were saved, and a couple other different topics. Towards the end, though, he touches on our home life. As believers, what's our relationship, our responsibility to our home life? And in verse 25, he touches on what the husband's responsibility is to their home life, to their spouse. Before that, he kind of touches on the wife's responsibilities as well, if you want to go back and look at that. But this morning, I wanted to just focus on what is our responsibility to our wives as husbands. So starting in verse 5, chapter 5, verse 25. Thanks. That's why my wife is here, keep me in check. Thanks. Starting in verse 25 of chapter 5, it says, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they fed and cared for their body just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Going back to verse 25 of this passage, there's something that we don't want to skip over, something we don't want to miss. And it's right at the beginning, the first 4 words. Paul says, husbands, love your wives. Husbands, love your wives. And on the surface-y kind of a thing, when I first started thinking about that, I'm like, okay, like kiss your wife on the way out the door to go to work, right? And tell her you love her before you go on a business trip or special occasions and stuff like that. Maybe say I love you before you go to bed at night. And then I started like researching the passage here, and I was like, what does the word love here really mean? What does that look like if you were to put it into a picture sense? And the Greek word here means to love dearly, to love fondly, and to seek the highest good for the other person. It's an unselfish love. It's not about us as husbands. It's about our wives. It's about putting them above ourselves. It's about putting their needs above ours. It's above seeking the highest good for them. The same word, which I find is really interesting here, the same word, love, that was used for how we're supposed to love our wives is the same word that's used in the second half of this verse, where it says, Christ has loved the church and gave himself up for it. It's the same love. So the way that Christ loves the church and gave himself up for her is the same love, the same way that we're supposed to love our wives. And I just started thinking about that, and I'm like, man, that's pretty heavy. Like, that's a lot of responsibility. Like, that's a big love. That's a heavy love. It's not just some light thing where you say love you. Like, it's unselfish, and putting them above yourself. And this morning, I just want to challenge us as husbands and ask us to be honest with ourselves. Are we loving our wives with this kind of love that Paul describes here? Are we loving our wife dearly and fondly with the TV shows and the movies we watch, the websites that we visit? I have nothing against internet, nothing against cable or anything like that. This is just a personal conviction that Faith and I felt when we were dating and when we got married. We talked about so much marriage stuff when we were dating. It was crazy. I felt like we were married already, but we weren't. But I remember, like, we sat down and had a discussion when we were engaged, and we were talking about, like, okay, when we get married and when we move in together and stuff like that, what do we want our house to look like? And at first I was like, well, you're the woman, you pick all the colors and all that, right? And we were like, no, like, what? I was like, you don't want me picking colors. I was like, and so, like, no, like, what do we want in our house? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. What does that look like? What do we want that to look like for us? Like, what is God calling us to have the environment, the foundation in our house look like? And one thing that we were, like, pretty set on was we didn't want internet in the house. And again, if you have internet, that's fine. There's nothing bad, like, you're not sinning or anything if you have internet at your house. But that was just a personal conviction for us. We were pretty transparent when we were dating, and when I was a teenager, I struggled with pornography, and that was something that I didn't want to like relapse into or like set myself up for failure. And so we had that discussion, and so that was one thing that we struggled with when we, well, not struggled with, but we determined when we got married and before we got married that was something we didn't want in the house, with all the pop-ups and like the filth and stuff like that you get on there right at your fingertips. We didn't want that temptation right there at the kitchen, right there when you come down from like doing your devotions and you got like the internet right there or something like that. For us, that was just something that God put on our hearts. What are things in your life that maybe God has put convictions on, or things in your life that you know are weak points for you, but yet you still put those temptations right in front of yourself every day? And how can you make those changes so that it makes a healthier environment, a healthier place for your family and for your marriage? What changes do you need to make? And some of them might be drastic, but that's okay. Are you seeking the highest good for your wife and having unselfish love for her with your thought life and what you look at? I know summertime's coming and you go to the beach or you go to the pool, and you've got some people that decide that they would rather wear no clothing than be modest. And I mean, let's be honest, for guys, that's a struggle, for most of us at least. I haven't gotten there yet, so that's a struggle. So we have to guard our hearts, guard our minds, because we have an enemy that wants to see us fail. We have an enemy that wants to see nothing else but us to go to hell, to be blunt. 1 Peter 5:8 says, "Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." This verse came to mind, and we actually discussed this verse at our middle school retreat a few weeks ago, and they shared a video. I didn't use that as an illustration this morning. Faith's laughing because I'll tell you in a minute what it is. But they showed a video, and it probably was somewhere from National Geographic or some kind of show like that. And it was basically a picture of like a kind of like a prairie or an open plain with like the tall grasses, and there was a few like shade trees and such. And they zoomed in on these two like little trees that were providing some shade, and there was this cute little innocent, helpless like calf that like probably was just born like a day or so before, and it was still trying to like get its grasp on life and walking and stuff like that. And it was standing up, but it was like you could tell it was like really wobbly, like it like was still learning how to balance and all that. And then in the background, you start seeing like the grasses move, and you're like, that's not the wind. And you realize there's a full-size male lion approaching the calf, its prey. That's what Satan is to us. He doesn't care how helpless you are. He doesn't care how innocent you are. He doesn't care how good you are. He will take every opportunity, every advantage that he can to destroy your walk with God, to destroy your life, and to send you to hell. He can't send us to hell, but he will encourage us to make choices that will destroy our relationship with God, destroy our marriages, destroy like everything that God has created that is good for us. He doesn't want us to experience those things. So guard your hearts, guard your minds. If there's something in your house, if there's something in your life, if there's something at work that you know is a temptation, that you know is pulling you away from your wife, is pulling you away from your relationship with God, get rid of it. Get rid of it. It doesn't make you a coward. It doesn't make you a wimp for running away from it or fleeing from it. It makes you smart. I've known people that have left their jobs because they knew it was either leaving their job or their marriage, leaving their job or their walk with God was just going down the drain. God will supply all our needs. And if there's a certain part of your life, whether it's your job or something at home, that you're like, well, I can't get by without this. I can't get by without the internet. Like, you can. It is a little harder, and there are some challenges that you run into, but God provides, and he'll make a way. Going back to the passage in Ephesians, looking at verses 26 and 27, it says that Christ gave his life for the church so that we could be made holy, clean, radiant, without stain, wrinkle, or blemish, but holy and blameless. I mean, that sounds like a pretty good example of being dearly loved, of being fondly loved, of seeking the higher good for someone else, doesn't it? I mean, that sounds like we're on the winning side of that relationship. It's an unselfish love. And that example of love is the example that Christ gives us as husbands on how to love our wives. It's a big responsibility. When you say "I do," you're not just saying that to the person standing in front of you. You're saying that to God. You're saying that to God and that making that into a covenant. And then Paul goes on and says again, husbands ought to love their wives. This time, he says they should love their wives as they love their bodies. And when I first read that, I was kind of like, what does that mean? Like, what does that look like? Because you think of someone, like maybe you know someone that is like really vain and just kind of like, they're like, oh yeah, the summer's here. Like, let's go to the beach. And they're just all about their body, and it's like, oh, yeah, I got to get ready for summertime because like the pool's coming and all that. And maybe you've seen those commercials for Planet Fitness and the big old guys that are all like just bodybuilders. I pick things up and put them down. Like, I mean, that's what I thought when I first read it. I was like, that's what you want us to be like? No, I was like, no, that can't be right. And it wasn't. It's just my ADD or something, I don't know. When I looked at this passage, I sat there and meditated on it. I was like, what does that mean? Love your wife as you love your bodies. What is that, like, how do you put that into action? And I sat there and asked God to, like, show me what that means. Show me what that looks like. I feel stupid in this sense, but, like, show me what that looks like. Like, just help me out. Like, throw me a bone here, God. And he did. He threw me Mark 10, 6 through 8. And that just popped into my head. And I was like, all right, God. So I started looking at it. And Mark 10, 6 through 8 says, but at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So here in Mark 10, God tells us that we're one flesh with our spouse. One flesh. Marriage is designed to be a permanent bond between a man and a woman. Not a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, or whatever else you want to put together. Like, it's between a man and a woman. It's very, very clear there. And you, as a husband or a wife, are a team with your spouse. You're no longer two. You're no longer an individual. You're part of a team. So this morning, if your spouse is here, look at them right in the eyes and say, we're a team. We're a team. You guys are so quiet this morning. That's all right. I kind of sprung that on you last minute. But you're a team. You're a team with your spouse. And I have an illustration that I want to share with you. And it was a kind of an illustration that I got through a fellow that I worked with before I came here to First Baptist Church. And before I came here on staff to First Baptist, I did carpentry up in New Oxford at the Brethren Home. And one of the guys that had been there for a long time was showing me how to graft two boards together for a project that we were doing. We did a lot of kitchen work and custom woodworking, and he was showing me how to graft two pieces of wood together for a project that we were doing. And he's a believer, and he was sharing with me how grafting two boards together is a great illustration of marriage and the bond that we have as husband and wife. Don't worry, this is not the kind of work I do. It was just for illustration purposes. If you're like, what is that? I'm like, I don't know what it is. It's just two boards glued together. So if you're like, nah, I know why you're a youth pastor, not a carpenter anymore. That could be a reason why. But I picked these two pieces of wood, and I glued them together. So they're permanently bonded now. The glue has dried and set. And there's really no way for me to break these apart without damaging one of these boards, or both, to be honest. When you put wood glue on a piece of wood and it sets and it dries, there's no way to, like, when you rip it apart, you don't break the glue, you break the board. The glue is so strong that you can't break that bond, okay? So if I were to rip these two boards apart, which I can't physically because I'm not a very big guy, but if I got a screwdriver or something and kind of pried them apart, we would find out something that I'm going to show you in a minute. But for illustration purposes, the glue that's in between these boards represents God in a believer's marriage. And each board represents a spouse, a man and a woman. I've got another two pieces of wood here that I actually glued together and ripped apart. I did use a screwdriver. I would like to tell you I did it by hand, but I couldn't. And these two pieces of wood were glued together, and I ripped them apart for the simple illustration, and notice that they're two different colors. This is a darker wood, and this is a lighter wood. But if you look at where it was glued, you'll see the darker wood is attached to this board now. There's no way after I glued these two boards together that they would be individual in and of themselves without being damaged. And I say that, I go through all that like illustration about carpentry because as believers and non-believers as well, when you make a covenant to be with someone for the rest of your lives, till death do you part, the Bible says you become one flesh. One flesh. What God has joined together, let no man separate. And if you're here divorced, trust me, I've got my own faults. Like, I'm not judging you by any means. I'm not trying to put a guilt trip on you or anything like that. But for us, people that are here that are married, you can't separate from your spouse without causing damage, without causing hardship. And sometimes there's already hardship there, and that's what causes divorce most of the time. But when God puts something together that's not meant to be broken, and we break it, there's damage that is done. And that's the strength that God has when he bonds something together. And so when this passage in Mark says they're no longer two but one, that's what it means in Ephesians when it's saying love your wife the way that you love your body. Because if that person is your wife, then you've obviously made a commitment to be with them. You've made a commitment, a lifelong bond to love that person. And when you're no longer two, but you're one now, when you love your wife, you're really loving yourself. And when you love yourself, you're really loving your wife. Because there's no way that you can love one without the other. Especially when you consider yourself a team. When you consider yourself a team. I know like the divorce rate in America is probably at least 50% now. And there's a lot of broken marriages, a lot of broken hearts. I just encourage us as husbands that we would love our wives the way that Christ loves the church. That we would love our wives the way that we love our bodies. That we would love our wives and be on a team with them, not just individuals. I know growing up, before I got married, I sunk a lot of money into cars, and once I turned like 16, I was just like, got a job, not so I could support myself, so I could support my car. And you could ask my parents, I dumped thousands of dollars into all kinds of stuff that was just, I look back now and I'm like, oh, I could be a millionaire in early retirement right now if I hadn't had a car. But when I met Faith and we were talking about getting married and we got engaged and we got closer, something hit me one day. I was like, I'm going to have to stop like putting all this money into a car because I've got a wife now. And there was a sacrifice that needed to be made. And I know that there are some people out there that are like, I'm not making that sacrifice. I'm making a sacrifice by marrying the person. Like, that's their attitude. And when we're considering marrying somebody, we really need to consider the sacrifice, because there is sacrifice in a relationship. There is a sacrifice in being part of a team. It's no longer about you, it's about the team. And just encourage us this morning that if there are things that you're still holding on to that you need to sacrifice or give up for your wife, for your kids, for your family, for God, that we would make that change today, that we would take advantage of that opportunity this morning. So many times we will go to God and be like, God, come on, can you help me out here? Can you like show me what I need to do? And God's like, I just did. And we're like, yeah, but not right now, maybe like next week or something after I do the stuff that I want to do. Well, this morning you have an opportunity to make that change. God's given you an opportunity to surrender whatever it is that's holding you back, that's holding your marriage back, that's holding you back as a father for your kids, that's holding you back from being the husband that you need to be to your wife. He's given you an opportunity this morning to change that. And I encourage you, if God's working on your heart this morning, don't walk out of here and be like, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it next week. I'll do it next year. Take advantage of it now and let God work. Paul says 3 times in these few verses that we just read to love our wives. I think he's trying to get a point across that we as husbands are to love our wives. And not just with a shallow love, a surfacey love, but with a dear love, a love that puts them and their greatest good above ours, a love like Christ loved the church. I want to share one more illustration with you, and this illustration, don't tune out if you're not into sports, but it's regarding baseball. So don't worry, I'm not a huge baseball fan, but for this morning's service, I am. I'm more of a hockey fan. Go Caps. Sorry if anyone's a Penguins fan. But it's regarding baseball. And if you've ever watched baseball, the game of baseball, you'll notice that sometimes you'll see a batter come up to the plate, and you're like, they can knock it out of the park. Like they're gonna advance the runner, and this is gonna, like, I don't want to miss this. And then all of a sudden, you'll see them grab the bat, and they're starting to hold it like this. And you're like, what are they doing? And they're going to bunt instead of swing the bat, right? And you're just like, come on. Like, that's just going to ruin the game. But coaches sometimes will use bunting as a strategy, right, to advance a runner, advance someone on their team for the better good of the team. The primary reason for a bunt is to move someone along that's on the offensive team so that they're in a better position to score. And when the coach gives the sign to the batter that he wants him to bunt, sometimes this can come to a surprise, like as a surprise to the batter. It may come at a time when he was planning on swinging for the fence or to just get a really good hit. He may have planned to improve his average or to improve his stats. He may have even planned to just show off his strength or serve notice to the pitcher that he can't strike him out. Sometimes we feel like we need to prove ourselves, right? We can't take the humble road. We got to prove ourselves to our boss or to our wives that we're the man. And sometimes that's not what God's calling us to do. That's not what the coach is calling us to do. Sometimes we'll hear the coach tell us it's in the best interest of the team for you to sacrifice your swing. For you to sacrifice your swing, even if that means you're going to get thrown out. You'll see a really good hitter come up to hit sometimes, and they'll hit a bunt down the third baseline to advance the runner to second, and they get thrown out. And you're like, man, but sometimes that's what God calls us to do. Sometimes we have to change our independent agenda for the better of the team. And I believe that God has called every man in the context of his relationship with his wife to lay down his sacrifice bunt, to not have his way simply because he's the man, and to raise the question, is the decision that I'm making in the best interest of the team? Is it in the best interest of the other person? Yes, God has put, I believe, the man as the head of the household, but that doesn't mean we rule with an iron fist. That doesn't mean that we dictate and delegate everything. Sometimes God asks us to bunt and to sacrifice. And that's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. It's a sign of humility. And sometimes our wives need to see that in us. Our wives need to be led by that example. As a husband, I want to challenge us this morning as we wrap things up to just take a minute and you will just close your eyes for a minute. Just ask yourself honestly, just between you and God, are you and your wife on the same team? Are you playing for the same team? Or are you playing for different teams this morning? If you're not playing on the same team, I want to give you an opportunity in a couple minutes to come forward and ask God what changes you need to make to get on the same team. Do you need to ask God for forgiveness or change some habits that you know aren't healthy for your marriage? Ask God what those changes are. Ask him this morning to help you to see what your weaknesses are and how he can work in and through them to strengthen your marriage and to strengthen your relationship with him. Dear Lord, we just thank you for this morning, and we just thank you for your word, even though sometimes it is challenging, it is hard, but we know your yoke is easy. And even if something seems hard or maybe out of reach, we know that nothing is out of reach with you. We just lift up the marriages here. We lift up the relationships. Pray that you would just help us to be playing on the same team as our spouses, that we wouldn't be competing against each other. We wouldn't look at each other as the enemy or the competition, but we'd look at each other as the teammates, as part of the team. pray that you would just help us to love our wives the way that you loved the church and gave yourself up for her. That we would just love fondly, love dearly, and just put the highest good of our spouse above ourselves. Pray that you would just strengthen each marriage here this morning, and I pray that you would just help us to just be a blessing to our wives, and that you would just be glorified in how we live our lives, that we would just be men of God that are seeking you, that are being role models for our children, role models for our wives, and role models just to everyone that we come in contact with, this world. We love you, Lord, and we just praise you for we know everything is possible through you. It's in Jesus' name.